Welcome to anybody who's joining us either for the first time or you're back after maybe some weeks not being with us. It's good to have you here today. Just a bit of a housekeeping, not a housekeeping announcement. That sounds really dull and serious, doesn't it? But we've got next Sunday, if you would join us for our Vision Sunday presentation. We do this once a year where we share the vision for the year, and we've got some exciting things that we're sharing around how we can all engage as church family in the mission and the vision of what City Life Church is about. And so join us next week at 9:30 or 11:30 for Vision Sunday presentation. Well, I don't know whether you like going to the movies, going to see films. I guess these days, like, people aren't going to the cinema in the same way. We went to see a real kind of big Marvel film a few months ago. And there was hardly anybody there, almost anybody there. It was me, my wife, and a few ladies at the back. That was more about that. But which means that we'd spread our legs wide, we can have a great time and have the cinema to ourselves. But in that Marvel film, Marvel, if you don't kind of watch Marvel films or what have you, they usually have like a post-credit scene. A scene in which where the film has officially finished and the credits come on the screen, and then there's a post-credit scene. And sometimes with Marvel films, it's just like light-hearted comedic moment, sometimes comedic moment that isn't actually very funny. And then but sometimes there's actually a significant scene that happens after the film in the post-credit scene. And it's a little bit like that today. Our text, our passage is a little bit like that today, where Jesus has taught us through the Lord's Prayer. It's the perfect prayer because it comes from Jesus. And there's almost a point to which where we're expecting Jesus now to move on to a different subject. But in our passage in Luke 11:5, verse 5 to 9, we see Jesus actually, it's like a post-credit scene. He's not finished with prayer. Our Lord has something else to impart to us with regards to prayer. And so this is the finale of our prayer series. You were thinking, are we moving on to a different subject? We are going to be doing that from next week. But this is the finale, and it's in the post-credit scene, so to speak, of Luke 11, verse 5 to 9. This is what Jesus says. Which of you who has a friend will go to him at midnight and say to him, friend? Not much of a friend, is it? Because he doesn't even say the name. Like Stephen, Bill, who knows? Like friend. It's just a kind of a trick for church, is if you kind of forgetting names every so often, which never happens to me. Just, hey friend, hey dude, hey fella, like how you doing? But he says, hey friend, lend me 3 loaves for a friend of mine. Again, no name. This guy's rubbish at names, isn't it? A friend of mine has arrived on a journey, and I have nothing to set before him. And he will answer from within the house, do not bother me. The door is now shut and my children are with me in bed. I can't get up and give you anything. Jesus continues, I tell you though, even though he will not get up and give him anything because he's his friend, yet because of his impudence, he will rise and give him whatever he needs. And I tell you, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. For our season finale of our prayer series, Thoughts and Prayers, I'm bringing a message today that I'm calling Push. Push. If you like the person sitting next to you, turn to them and say, push. Push. I don't know about you, but I still remember the day where I left school for good. Most of my life back then had been filled with classes and exams and having to go to school and study subjects that I wasn't really too interested in for the most part. And so that day came where the school bell rang, if we were in America, but we're not. There's no school bell. But the 3:30 came, and I walked out of the school premises as a free man. A free man. And I was ready to spend the rest of my life playing FIFA and Football Manager until 1 o'clock in the morning and wake up at 12 o'clock the next day. I was happy to do that. But 20 minutes into the euphoric feeling of leaving school and never having to go back to school again, this daunting thought dropped into my mind, and it was this: what am I going to do next? Because I knew that realistically, I couldn't just spend the rest of my life playing games. I had to actually go about and get a job, a job. I had to transition ultimately away from adolescence into manhood, masculinity, manhood, and get a job and do all of that stuff. And there's that sense in which where Jesus has finished presenting the perfect prayer. We've been walking through that over the last few weeks. The Lord's Prayer and the 6 different petitions in the Lord's Prayer. There's a sense in which where we're asking today, what next? Like we've learned more about prayer. We've studied prayer a little bit. We've heard about it if you've been around over the last few weeks about prayer. And we might be tempted to put our notes in a wardrobe somewhere or in a bedside table somewhere and save those notes for a rainy day and just get back onto our normal way of living, our normal way of praying. And that's a little bit silly when you think about it. It's like someone paying for musician lessons to learn a certain instrument. Go through all of that, weeks and weeks and weeks of tuition and time and finance. And then the guy finishing the music lessons, taking whatever it is that he's been learning, his instrument, his cello, his sax, whatever, his guitar, and puts it in a cupboard somewhere and think, okay, I've mastered musicianship. I know that instrument. Well, I'm never going to play it again. That's silly, right? And so some of us, we've been hearing about prayer over the last few weeks, but now's the time to really practice it. And Jesus has one more thing to impart to us. And it may be the most powerful principle on prayer that we can hear after reading the Lord's Prayer. And so we've looked at the chords of the Lord's Prayer, how there's 6 different chords. Our Father in heaven, that's the chord of praise. Your kingdom come, your will being done is the chord of priorities. And forgive us our sins as we forgive others who sinned against us is the chord of people. Who has people problems in the room today? Most of our problems are connected to a person. If not the person sitting next to you, somebody who's not here, or even the person who's sitting in your seat, which is you. We are sometimes our worst problem in life, aren't we? And then another chord is lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. That's the power chord. If you know guitar a little bit, there's power chords. And it's like the power chord is lead me not into temptation, but deliver me from evil. And so those are some of the chords there that we've been looking at. And the question is, what next? Do we tuck away our prayer instrument? And when we have a problem, we pull the notes out, we pull that instrument out, and then we pray a little bit. And what we're going to realize from the passage is that mindset will not do at all. Some of you might be thinking, you're rubbish at prayer. I'm rubbish at prayer. But let me just encourage you. Maybe you're not rubbish at prayer. Maybe you just need a routine. And it seems that our Lord desires us to pray until prayer becomes part of who we are. The prayer is not something that we do occasionally, but prayer is something that we should do persistently. That it's something that prayer ought to be something which becomes part of our very nature itself. The Greek philosopher Aristotle once said this, that we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. C.S. Lewis, the great Christian philosopher and thinker in the 20th century, wrote a book called Mere Christianity, and he takes on Aristotle's idea and puts it through Scripture and improves it. And he said this, every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you're slowly turning this central thing into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. So the goal for us is not that we become a person who prays. The goal is that we become a praying person. That prayer becomes such second nature to us that it becomes part of our nature. It becomes part of our identity. It becomes part of how we handle stuff in life. That prayer is not an instrument that we pull out from a dusty cupboard somewhere, but prayer is something we handle. Prayer is something we weave into the fabric of our everyday life. So when you feel that anxiety welling up from the inside of you, which anxiety seems to have that propensity to do that, you know, you're anxious about something, it goes away, but then it comes back. And sometimes that wave of anxiety can come back stronger than before. So when we are in that sense of anxiety, what do? We've learned the chords. We practice our chords. We practice what we've been learning in the Lord's Prayer to play maybe the chord of praise, to learn to become a person who isn't just stuck in anxiety and all that stuff, but we learn to play the chord of praise, where in the midst of our feelings, which are valid and are there and are genuine, in the midst of those feelings, we're saying, God, I want to press into praise. I want to press into your presence. I want to be a person who's not defined by what I feel, but who I am in Jesus, who I am in you. Maybe there's a need in our life, a need of provision, finance, a job, all that stuff in life that we just need to put food on the table. There's sometimes, anxieties around provision. Well, let's play the chord of provision. Father, give us our daily bread. Give us our daily bread. What we're saying is, God, I want to come to you as my provider, knowing that you're a good father and you're in control of this situation. It might be anxious, it might be tricky, but I'm going to play the chord of provision. Or it could be that we have a disordered desire within us that rears its ugly head at certain times. Often when we're tired, we feel tempted. Temptation and tiredness often go hand in hand, where our willpower is out of fuel. It's at the end of the day, and we're tempted by various things, and we can learn to play the power chord. In the midst of that vulnerability, in the midst of that temptation, we can pray the power chord, which is, lead me not into temptation, but deliver me from evil. And so what is the goal here? The goal is to be a praying person, to be the type of person where it becomes almost automatic that when something hits us, when we're in a challenge, that our auto response becomes more tilted towards prayer, that we keep that instrument of prayer with us all the time. It's part of who we are. And in that, like using C.S. Lewis's language, it's like the central part of you is beginning to change into the type of creature which mirrors the person of Jesus. Maybe this is what Paul means in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5:17, when Paul encouraged his congregation in Thessalonica in Greece to pray without ceasing. What does that look like? To pray without ceasing. It's like prayer becomes such a part of our response. Prayer becomes such a part of our identity and nature that whatever happens, we begin to pray. Why? Because we're a praying person. Here's what we need to learn to do. We need to learn to push. What does push mean? Push is an acronym for what we're calling pray until something happens. You can create your own P if you want to. Like just play until something happens or whatever. But we're saying pray until something happens. Jesus is asked at the top of Luke 11, Lord, teach us how to pray. And then he gives us the Lord's Prayer, which is the perfect prayer. We've looked at that. But then in verse 5 to 9, he actually continues to answer the question. Jesus is not done answering the question. It's part 2 of his response to the question, teach us how to pray. And what he goes on to, he's just like any great communicator, he tells a story. He gives an illustration. And in Luke 11, verse 5, he says, which of you who has a friend will go to him at midnight? We'll work through these verses in the next few minutes. But just pause there for a minute, because midnight in this culture, which is an electricity-less culture, if that's a word, midnight really is midnight. It's in the middle of the night. There's no lights about. It's very dark, apart from candlelight. It's pitch black. It's spooky. It's scary. It's midnight. And in that context, everybody's asleep. Most people around would have been asleep during this in this village, for example. And here comes a man asking for bread. And we see what happens here in the second part of verse 5. And say to him, friend, lend me 3 loaves. For a friend of mine has arrived on a journey. I've got nothing to set before him. And he will answer from within the house, do not bother me. Don't bother me. Like, I've turned my phone off. I know they didn't have phones. I've closed the blinds. The light's off. Get the message. Like, I don't want to be bothered. You ever kind of try to talk to someone who doesn't want to be bothered? You can kind of tell by their face. They're not wanting to engage with you. But this guy persists. But what's interesting is notice that this guy didn't have an emergency. It wasn't like someone's fallen over and broke their shoulder, or someone in my house, like one of my children, is sick and I need a first aid kit. I know you're good with that kind of stuff. Like, please help. It's an emergency. Like, call 999. It's not. It's like all the situation was this guy had a person arrive at their house late. Maybe the buses in Jerusalem were on strike or something. Who knows? And so they were late. And so the guys got there late. Their friends got there late. And he's like, I'm going to wake you up in the middle of the night, wake up all of your family, because in this culture, they would all be in kind of a one-bedroom house, and everyone would sleep in the same bed. That sounds like a nightmare. All the family in one bed. Yeah, like all the time. That doesn't sound very great, does it? Well, that's what happened. And so everybody woke up. This guy was waking up. Why? Because I just want to have some fun. I want to be hospitable to my friend. I need to give him something to eat. Is that an emergency? Like, wait until morning. The guy hasn't turned up until midnight. He can just go straight to sleep. So this Jesus is painting this picture that the friend who's asking his other friend for some bread, he's been a little bit insensitive. He's been a little bit pushy. He's been a little bit rude and even unreasonable. In verse 8, it continues, and I tell you, though, he will not get up and give him anything because he's his friend. Yet because of his impudence, he will rise and give him whatever he needs. The man who's knocking at his friend's door at silly o'clock gets what he's asking for. Why? How did that happen? Not because, Jesus said, not because he's his friend, but because of this man's boldness, because of this man's persistence, because of this man's impudence. In fact, the word Jesus he uses has an interesting language to it. In the ESV, it says impudence, which is our translation here in our passage. Other translations translate the word as shamelessness, because of the man's shamelessness, because of the man's rudeness. I think the NLT translation actually puts two words together, and Jesus says in the NLT, because of this man's shameless audacity, he got what he was asking for. Jesus here is giving us a model for how to pray to God. He's not giving us license to be rude to our friends or whoever else we're asking things for, but he's given us permission to be unreasonable when it comes to prayer. He's given us permission ultimately to be bold and persistent when it comes to prayer. Jesus is effectively teaching us here, I want you to be like this man in the story. I want you, in other words, to bother God. When's the last time you bothered God? When's the last time you really pressed into prayer and said, God, I don't want to settle. I'm going to ask again. I'm going to ask again. And I'm going to be persistent. Actually, the word bother is actually in our passage in Luke 11, verse 7. It says, and he will answer from within, do not bother me. The friend's saying, don't bother me. Like, get the message. The lights are off. No candles are being lit right now. We don't want to help you. But yet, this man was persistent. He didn't just knock once, because if you knock once, it could be a mouse, it could be a bird, coming against the door. When you rock up to a friend's house, what do you need to do? You need to knock, and knock again. And that way they know you actually are there. It's not just like a coincidence or whatever. But if they don't answer straight away, what do? You knock, and you knock, and you knock again. Some of you don't go away. You're so persistent when it comes to like getting someone's attention. Like, you keep ringing. How many times is it acceptable to ring somebody if they don't answer? For me, I think it's twice. For me, after that, I'm just being a pain. I'm not going to ring more than twice in a row, yeah? If it was an emergency, I might send you a text as well. But this guy was not giving up. He was going after it. He was knocking, and he was knocking again. And Jesus gives his disciples and has given us a powerful key to prayer: persistence. The principle of persistent prayer. This passage in some quarters is actually known as the parable of the persistent friend. And when Jesus is teaching us, what Jesus is teaching us here runs against often how we normally pray. Let's be honest, we sometimes pray once and we forget about it. And we just accept the status quo. But Jesus said, no. I want you to be unreasonable. I want you to practice persistent prayer until it becomes part of the fabric of who you are. We're being invited, in other words, to continually, relentlessly come back to God and bring our petition again. Jesus here didn't just teach this once. He actually taught this multiple times. 7 chapters later, in Luke 18, Jesus tells a story, a parable about an unjust judge. And in Luke 18, Jesus uses another illustration which is startling when you think about it. There's a judge who is described in the passage, in the story, as unjust and indifferent. And there's a widow, the second character. And the widow approaches the judge for justice, but the judge doesn't want to give her justice. So what does the widow do? She persists. In fact, Jesus says this in Luke 18, 6-7, to summarize the parable. The Lord said, "Hear what the unrighteous judge says. And will not God give justice to his elect, who cry to him not once, but day and night?" Day and night. In other words, bother him. Become a bother. Become someone who can practice persistent prayer. Present your request to God persistently. This is why Jesus likens prayer to knocking on a door. You've got to knock more than once, otherwise it won't get anybody's attention. What is Jesus doing here? He's surprising us with a surprising invitation to be unreasonable. Some of us are far too polite when it comes to prayer. This is not a license to not be polite to people. I'm persistent. I'm unreasonable, demanding. But this is an invitation that Jesus gives us to be bold, to be persistent, to even be unreasonable. I once was sitting down, actually a few weeks ago, with some friends, and we had some food and what have you, and ordered some drinks, and I ordered a sparkling water with ice. And the waitress brought the sparkling water across, and I looked at the label, and it said sparkling water. I was like, good job, and because often they get confused. And I put the sparkling water into the cup, and there was no bubbles. It's like, okay, this could be a new innovation where they've created a sparkling water that doesn't have any bubbles, maybe. Technology is advancing so quick these days, you never know. Tasted it, was flat as a pancake. So I was like, okay. I put my hand up like I was at school. Said, hey, this sparkling water is not sparkling. It's got no bubbles. She looked at me oddly, as if I was like weird. Like, I want my sparkling water, please. So she brought across another bottle that said on the bottle, sparkling water, and then opened that up. Again, no bubbles. It was flat as a pancake. It got to the point where some people around the table, my wife particularly, was like, just stop it. Give it up. Just settle down. Calm down. Like, just drink your flat sparkling water. And I mean, I'm paying £2.50 for this thing. I want my bubbles. I want my bubbles. And so I went across. Well, I didn't. I just got her attention, shouted, "Oi!" Kind of. I didn't. I was nice. And I said, look, it's got no bubbles. This is the second bottle now. I asked again, can you bring across another bottle and kind of hope it works out? She says, okay, I know the problem. I should have told you this before maybe, but we had a problem with the manufacturer. They've been sending flat sparkling water bottles. It's like, why have you made me feel so bad and so unreasonable about persisting here? And she was like, oh, sorry about that. We'll take it all off the bill. I enjoyed 3 bottles of water for free, all flat as a pancake, but I was really hydrated. It was fantastic. I went to the toilet after 20 minutes. It was fantastic. And I'm thinking, my theory is, I couldn't quite quantify this through asking her again, because this is weird, asking too many questions. I didn't want to be that weird guy. But I reckon the theory of why she didn't say anything on the front end, even though she knew there was a problem with the bottles and the manufacturer, etc., was because she was expecting me to put up with flat water. She was expecting me to be reasonable. But I was like, you haven't met me. When I want bubbles, I'm going to be unreasonable. I want my sparkling water. I'm having my Sunday lunch. I want a sparkling water right here over ice. I'm not going to settle. And I wonder how many times we can settle into maybe it's what's expected of us, or our status quo, or settle into comfortable, when God's saying, I want you to ask one more time. I want you to be a bit more unreasonable. I want you to be someone who presses in. In fact, in the Greek, there's the idea in the parable of the unjust judge, where the woman, the reason why the judge gives in is because she's like blackening the eye of the judge. It's like the judge says, she's wearing me out. It's like the persistent widow so kind of in his face that his eyes are beginning to like have a black eye. That's the idea in the Greek. And it's this idea of, come on, we've got to be more persistent here. And here's the principle is unreasonable people change things. What do Martin Luther King Jr., Winston Churchill, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Rosa Parks, William Wilberforce, what do these greats in history all have in common? What they have in common is at one point in history in their lives, they decided to be unreasonable. When everybody else was going in the flow, Churchill decided, no, we're not going to appease Hitler and what have you. This is not a history lesson. Rosa Parks, where it was perfectly, comfortably, culturally the thing that when the bus was full, black people would stand up and give their seat to a white person. As wrong as that is, as unjust as that is, that was what everybody was doing at that point in this, not too long ago, really, when you think about it. But she decided in her seat on a bus one day to be unreasonable. That I'm not going to stand up. But I'm gonna persist because this is not right. And what happened was all these unreasonable people, what did they do? They changed history in some particular way. Unreasonable people change things. Unreasonable prayer, persistent prayer, is able to change things. Prayer does not change the purpose of God, but it does change the action of God. And Jesus invites us to pray this prayer. He invites us to pray the prayer of priorities. God, may your kingdom come, your will be done. And so God's will, you could understand it as in two particular ways. You can understand God's will as the permissible will of God. God is in control, God's sovereign, whatever will happen, and we rest into the permissible will of God. God allows it. And also there's a perfect will of God. And the perfect will of God is what we're invited in the Lord's Prayer to pray and lean into. But it's only going to be persistence. It's only going to be prayers of persistence. Prayers that are unrelenting. Prayers that are without ceasing. It's only going to be those types of prayers that really change things in our life. When prayer becomes part of who we are. So the question then for us is, how much do we want it? Why do we so often settle for less when God's invitation is inviting us into more? There's actually a great story in the Old Testament, a great passage in 2 Kings, where Joash, the king of Israel at the time, had an opportunity to bring his people into total victory against his Syrian oppressors. The prophet Elisha invited King Joash, the king of Israel, to do something quite strange. It was kind of a prophetic action, so to speak, that had something powerful attached to it. And the prophet Elisha invited the king to strike the ground, and every strike would be a blow against the enemy. However, the king of Israel only struck the ground 3 times. And the prophet actually got angry at what the king had done because he'd only knocked 3 times. He'd only struck the ground 3 times. In 2 Kings 13:19, it reads, "Then the man of God was angry with him and said, 'You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck down Syria until you had made an end of it completely. But now you will strike down Syria only 3 times.'" And this had a real consequence in his generation. He could have completely brought peace as a king in his prophetic action with the prophet Elisha. But he only struck 3 times. It was like, you can imagine, like a half-hearted effort. Like, maybe he didn't believe that what he was actually doing in this moment was actually going to make any difference. It's like striking the ground 3 times. What does that do? And maybe today you're thinking, my prayers, my small little prayers, what can they do? And so we approach prayer just like how King Joash approached this prophetic moment where he was invited by the prophet to strike the ground. And he's like, struck the ground 3 times. And it was like, there you go. Are you happy? That didn't make any difference there, Elisha? And the prophet was angry because of the half-hearted effort of the king. And prayer is a little bit like that. We struck the ground 3 times, and God's saying, hey, I want you to be persistent. I want you not just to pray once or twice or 3 times. I want prayer to become such a part of you that it begins to turn your very identity and nature into a different person entirely, into the person and image of Jesus. Richard C. Trench said this. He's an Anglican bishop in the 19th century. Prayer is not getting man's will done in heaven, but getting God's will done on earth. It's not overcoming God's reluctance, but laying hold of God's willingness. I think this is such an important thought, because we can be thinking in this message around persistence is God's so reluctant, isn't he? But it's not. It's just that we're so half-hearted, aren't we? That's the reality. We're so half-hearted creatures. And we give up and we settle and we compromise and we make excuses. And God's like, I've given you a prayer to pray, lead me not into temptation. But you're not even asking, you're not even praying to me when you're struggling. You're just going through the same ritual. You're tired. You fall into that sin time and time again. And you're not really fighting it. You're flirting with it. You're not fleeing from it. You just made friends with it, and you're excusing it. And maybe the reason why there's certain patterns in our life, whether it be anxiety or sins of different natures and kinds, that aren't broken not because your prayers aren't working, but because your prayers are half-felt, because your prayers aren't persistent enough. And the problem maybe is that we're not praying persistently. Of course you prayed. You prayed about your anxiety. You prayed about this. You prayed about that. But maybe the reason why we're falling continually back into that pit is because we're not praying persistently. What does prayer do? Prayer doesn't just change God's actions, which prayer can do. God responds to prayer. That's the whole purpose of prayer. But also another purpose of prayer is it changes us. So even if the things around us aren't changing and we're praying and it doesn't seem to be working, in the midst of that, because we're spending time in God's presence, because we're practicing humility, which is what prayer is about, practicing, God, I can't do this myself. I need your Spirit. I need your help. My willpower is not enough to get through this. I need your Spirit. I need your help. In the midst of that, God is developing a character on the inside of us. Prayer doesn't just change things outside of you. Prayer changes things on the inside of you. Prayer changes us, disciples us, it sharpens us. That's the power of persistent prayer. Unreasonable people change things. Don't just strike the ground once or twice or even 3 times, Joash. Keep going. Keep striking that ground again and again and again until you see victory. Until you see that breakthrough, Joash. Don't settle for less. Don't do things half-heartedly. If you're going to worship, worship me properly. Worship me with all your heart, all your faculties, all your emotions. Love the Lord, you got all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. Worship him properly. Engage with him properly. Don't do things half-heartedly. Don't be reasonable. Be unreasonable. Ask for that sparkling water again. And again, and again. We were staying at a hotel recently. It was a Premier Inn. Usually Premier Inns have aircon. This one had aircon on the website, but then got into the room. It was like Egypt. But we weren't in Egypt. We were like somewhere in England. And in the room we walked in, there was 3 of us staying there, with my son as well included in that pack. And you've got to clarify that. And so in that, it was like Egypt, like walking. The aircon sounded like it was on. It was like making a hum. That's a weird. Actually, it was making like a kind of hum, but it wasn't working. Like the feel in the room was like it's a heat wave. It's like 12 degrees outside, but the hotel room felt like 40. I went down to the receptionist. The receptionist says, "Sir, it's working. I can see it on the panel here. It's working." I said, "Can you not reset it or something? It's not working properly. It feels really hot there. Give it 20 minutes, sir. Drink some sparkling water or whatever you ordered at the bar, and take your sparkling water upstairs and just wait 20 minutes. It'll be fine." We waited 20 minutes, it wasn't fine. So you know what? I wasn't going to be reasonable. I was going to be unreasonable. I went downstairs and asked again. She said, sir, it's working. The lights are on there. I can see in the panel it's working. I went back upstairs. Still wasn't working. I went downstairs again. The third time, you need to reset your system or we're going to get a refund and we're going to go to a travel lodge down the road. And I was really strong with her, right? And nice. You can say strong things and have a smile at the same time, you know? And she was like, so I'm really sorry. Let me come up to the room and check. And she came to the room. Her face flushed straight away. It was red hot. Yeah, you see? It's Egypt in here, not England. I want England back. And she was like, okay, I'm going to go downstairs and reset it. It reset. It worked. It's fine. We were happy. And we can go to sleep with aircon room. First world issues, isn't it really? But in the midst of all of that was persistence. And at some points, you know, there was a little bit of a glimmer in Amy's eye to say, please stop. We'll just settle in Egypt. And not get back to England here in the room. But I was like, no, I'm going to keep going, keep going, keep going. I don't know how many times I would have persisted. I probably would have just collapsed on the floor in a ball and just went to sleep, to be honest. But I persisted. Here's a question for us. What have you tolerated in your life that the Lord is calling you to be more unreasonable about? Unreasonable people change things. Pray until something happens. You got to strike that ground a little bit more. You got to pray that prayer a little bit more. James says, you ask not because you have not. Pray until something happens. God's given us permission to be a little bit pushy. Not to be nasty to people, but when it comes to prayer, to be a bit pushy. To have that intolerance when it comes to comfortable. That I'm going to press in. Unreasonable people change things. What did Jacob say when he was wrestling with the angel of the Lord? What did he say? He said, I will not let you go until you bless me. We need to have a bit more persistence here. We need to be a little bit more unreasonable here. What have you tolerated in your life that the Lord is asking you to be unreasonable about? Here's a second question for us to land on. What unreasonable problem needs to be confronted by unreasonable prayer? That thing, that habit will not flee from you with one prayer. It's got to be so ingrained in your day that you become so dependent upon God. God, lead me not into temptation. It's got to be such a persistent prayer where you're continually asking God to give you the grace, to give you the strength, to give you the wisdom, to give you the clarity of mind, to give you what only can come from Him, His supernatural strength coming into our lives and filling us again with His power and His grace and His supernatural ability. We can't, but God can. But we need to persist. We need to sometimes stand in the tension of not arriving where we should arrive and not settling back into where we used to settle back into, and press into the will of God. Press into God's willingness. God's not reluctant. It's that we sometimes are so tolerant. We're so heartfelt creatures, C.S. Lewis says. But here's the thing, we just need to be a little bit more persistent. Keep knocking. Bob Dylan's right. Keep knocking on heaven's door. Keep knocking on heaven's door. As the prophet Bob Dylan said, if you're praying the Lord's Prayer, you already know the notes. You just need to keep playing them. Keep that prayer instrument there. Keep it beside you. Let that prayer become part of your everyday expression so it becomes just as natural as the air that you breathe. Keep at it. Keep striking the ground. Keep praying. Keep doing it. Keep serving. Keep being faithful. Don't grow weary in doing good, for in the right time you'll reap a harvest. It's weary sometimes to keep at it, to keep in prayer, to keep persistent. But it's how history is changed, and it's how we partner with God in heaven to bring about His purpose in our lives, but also for those around us as well. Where's the gospel in all of this? Well, the gospel can be seen in this passage, in this parable, quite easily by the man who was not just asking for bread, right? He was asking for bread for his neighbor. But Jesus came to earth put a skin and bone on. The uncreated Son of God became a man and moved into our neighborhood. He didn't just ask for bread on our behalf. He became the bread. He became the bread of life so that we can come to him and receive that fresh life, receive that forgiveness, receive that Holy Spirit, receive that power to overcome some stuff. Have a relationship with God. All because of Jesus, we can now enter his gates with thanksgiving, and we can now come before the throne of grace with boldness, not timidity, but boldness. Boldness, persistence, persistently coming before God. And that's how we see God do the miraculous in our own hearts, changing who we are, changing how we think, changing what we love and what we don't love. In the process of time, seeing God's kingdom come. But it happens with pushy people, with prayerful people. A church that prays is a grown church, is a healthy church, a church that knows not just to rest back in comfortable, in the status quo. Nothing is built of significance without perseverance. Nothing is built of significance without perseverance. We've got to learn to press. Where are you tolerating right now? Where are you resting into compromise right now? Begin to get yourself back up. Don't go weary in doing good. At the right time, you'll reap a harvest, but you've got to keep pressing, keep pushing. Pray until something happens.